Hello, and thanks so much for joining us for the first of our videos during National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Today, we will be covering the red swamp crayfish. Thank you so much to everybody that participated in our poll to see which 5 species we will be covering this week. We hope that you find it as interesting as we did while we were putting it together. So with all of that in mind, let's get to talking about the red swamp crayfish, or Procambrus clarkii, but we'll just stick with red swamp crayfish. So some facts and identification about the red swamp crayfish. It's 5 inches long from the end of its tail to its claws, and that's when it's full grown. So as you can see, kind of the stance that this little one's taken here. From the back of the tail, they kind of keep their claws out to the front. So that's included when taking that measurement of 5 inches. They have a dark red body, especially on the top of the tail and the back here. There's kind of a dark line on the tail, and it gets a little lighter as you get towards the edges. But what you're really going to see jumping out at you, first of all, are going to be these bright red spots, or sometimes they even look like little spikes on their claws. That's going to be the main distinguishing features, that red color and those bright red bumps. They can reproduce twice in a year, but that's typically in areas where there's more flooding. So not likely to be twice a year in dry areas, but it is possible. And they do that during autumn and spring. The females can lay up to 500 eggs. It looks like that's on the higher end, but again, totally possible that they produce that many eggs. And the eggs are really small, 0.4 millimeters in size. So one of the next slides here, we're going to see an image of that, and I'll talk a little bit about why that size is important to note and be aware of. A similar looking species is the white river crayfish, and that's one of those down here. You can see, again, it has kind of that dark stripe on the top, and it does have similar little bumps along the shell and on the claws, like the red swamp crayfish has, but everything's lighter in color, almost this kind of yellowish brown, and those bumps are darker spots as opposed to the bright red. But kind of design and layout wise, they are very similar, but the coloration is very different. So not likely one that you're going to get confused for something else. Distribution. So they're actually native to North America, which is not all that common for some of the invasives that we discussed, but they're not native to the Midwest. You can find them in the Mississippi River or the Gulf region of the U.S., kind of the south and southeast area of the U.S. Is where you're likely to find them natively. There's not always a ton of data that they put out on where the locations are for these. They're very common food source in a lot of areas. So it's a difficult thing to put out information and keep people aware of where these things are, especially in terms of letting the public know about that information, because you run the risk of members of the public going out to harvest them, or even bringing them in to try and reproduce them to make more of these, again, because it is such a common food source in areas. So this map down here is from MISN, and it shows some of the data on where they are, kind of general locations in Michigan. So they are in the state, and because they're an aquatic species, they can move around quite a bit without folks noticing right away. So we want people to know about this species, and that it's out there and that it can move relatively unseen. They do like moving water as opposed to still water, but they can be found just about anywhere where there is a consistent water source, whether that's a pond, or again, they love rivers. Small bodies of water tend to be where they're found. And in those areas, you can see these chimneys like this one here that they'll make. And that's actually the female of the species that makes those. She's the one that burrows. Doesn't make note as to whether the males can burrow or they're just kind of lazy, but that's the female that make those burrows. And that's where the offspring get raised. These chimneys are common for several crayfish, though. So just because you're seeing these chimneys in or around bodies of water doesn't mean that it's necessarily red swamp crayfish. So just because you see the little crayfish chimney is not necessarily cause for alarm. So the issue with these is that they are a host for disease and parasites, in particular crayfish fungus plague, or commonly just referred to as crayfish plague. And that is a water mold, and that will kill a crayfish within a few weeks of introduction if it comes in contact, and many crayfish are susceptible to this fungus. So that's something to be aware of. They just kind of bring in this disease and it takes out the other native crayfish. They're also just kind of aggressive in particular with the other crayfish. They'll push them out of the area and kind of take over, and they eat just about everything, meaning they have a large impact on the food web. They'll eat plants, snails, amphibians, fish, insects, pretty much anything that you would expect to find in or around a body of water. They'll have a go at it. So they can, a lot of competition for food between them and other crayfish, and these guys tend to come out on top. So CD3, that's something we talk a lot about in the CISMAs in general, and that stands for clean, drain, dry, dispose. And that has to do with when you're doing any sort of aquatic recreational activity, that the equipment that you use that comes in contact with the water or the area surrounding the water, that gets cleaned off, and that things that you use get disposed of properly. In particular, baits, you can't just dump those back out into the water. That's how invasive species will spread. But in particular with these guys, here's those eggs that we talked about a little bit earlier on. They're not particularly big. They're dark in color, and if they get mixed in with some mud or something on the bottom of a boot or the hull of a boat, and you put that same boot or boat into another body of water and it has those eggs trapped in some mud, and that mud washes off, and now that's introduced into a different body and it is spread to a new area. So clean off all of your equipment when doing any sort of aquatic recreation, and let things dry out for at least 5 days before putting it into another body of water to ensure that things have really dried out, because these aquatic species are in that water for a reason. They need it to survive. So if it gets thoroughly dried out, those things that are clinging onto it and hiding out are very likely to die off. So that's what they're recommending for now, is just very thorough cleaning. A lot of the state launch sites for boats will have these cleaning stations with kind of a power washer sort of deal to use on the outside of your boat or your equipment. Any sort of debris, plant matter that you see hanging off anything you use in and around bodies of water needs to get cleaned off and allowed to dry, again, for those 5 days before putting it back in another body of water. So if you're curious about where we're getting this information or these images, these are going to be the sources for that. That is just kind of a quick synopsis. Of course, you can dive into the red swamp crayfish a bit further if that's something that you like to do. Misson has a lot of great information on it. But that's what we have for you today. So I hope you found it interesting. Thanks so much for stopping by to check it out. And I hope that you will join us tomorrow when we put in our next video about our species that you guys helped us select for the National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Thank you so much and have a nice day.